الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك وكرم ومجد على سيدنا محمد ختم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah. In our look at الدروس الرمضانية للأمة المحمدية, the Ramadan lessons for the Ummah of Muhammad, we are in the section where he, after speaking about the virtues of Ramadan as a specific time and the virtues of fasting in particular, and in previously speaking about the levels of those who fast, the fast of the general public, then the fast of the elites, and then the fast of the elite of the elites. And we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us that Ramadan after Ramadan to raise in the ranks from being of the fast of the general, right, to the fast of the elite, and then inshallah that we reach by His tawfiq and by His grace the fasting of the elite of the elites. One of the great examples of that type of fast is one of the great Tirimi scholars who mentioned that he would not read Quran at all in the daytime of Ramadan. And people, they kind of look down on him for that. Like, it's Ramadan, you're supposed to read Quran. Right? But he would not read anything, not even a single page in the daytime of Ramadan. And he would only do all of his reading at night. And they asked him why. He said, because every time I open the book of Allah and I start to read, Allah puts the sweetness of honey on my tongue. And I feel that it's contrary to the rulings of fasting. Right? It's as if I'm eating honey. Right, so I delayed all my fasting to the end, right, all my recitation to after Maghrib. Right, so his iftar is his qira'ah. MashaAllah, this is the fasting of the khusus, the elite of the elite. So after all of that, and setting the stage, he then goes into the ahkam of siyam, the rulings of fasting, and he mentions here that majority of these rulings are according to the madhab of Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i alayhi ridwanullahi ta'ala. Right, so whenever there is a situation where the opinion is not the same in the Hanafi school, inshallah we will try to mention the equivalent of the Hanafi madhab. But a lot of these rulings are equivalent, are the same in all of the schools. So he says first and foremost that the definition of Sawm, and we kind of alluded to this in the previous session, is imsak, is to refrain or to hold something back. And he says it is used in any time that there is a refraining or a holding back of something, then you can say that person sama, that person has fasted. Or you can say sama in Arabic, you might not want to translate it as fasted. Right? So he says, for instance, if someone is quiet and they stopped speaking, then you can say sama. So that's, and he refers to the verse of Surah Maryam, Inni nadartu lirrahmani sawman. I vowed a sawm for the most merciful, to the most merciful. And what was her sawm? فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. I will not speak to any human today. That was her vow. So she vowed an imsak. She vowed an imsak. She didn't vow to fast, but she vowed to hold back from speaking. And linguistically, that would be called sawm still in Arabic. But legally, the sawm that we're talking about is imsakun makhsus, a specific type of refraining, biniyatin makhsus, with a specific intention, min shakhsin makhsus, from a specific person. Right, so it's not just any refraining. Right, it has these three conditions. It has to be done in a special way, with a special intention, and the person must be of those who are qualified to do the fast, for the fast to count for them. So he's going to slowly break down those three things. Right? What does it mean by a special type of refraining? what are the stipulations of a specific intention, and who is the specific type of person. So first he starts talking about the specific person. He starts at the end. And so these are called what's called shurutul wujub, the conditions of obligation. So if these conditions are met, then on that person it is wajib. Or in the Hanafi school you would say fard. The Shafi'i school, wajib and fard are synonyms. Linguistically there's no difference, except in Hajj. Right, so if a person meets these next few conditions, and he mentions 4 of them, 4 conditions, then it is obligatory for them to fast, specifically. So the first and foremost condition is al-Islam, that they must be Muslim. Right, so the fasting of the non-Muslim, right, is not considered, it doesn't considered recognized as a legitimate fast in the Sharia sense, in the legal sense. However, whenever people do righteous deeds, even if they're non-Muslim, right, Allah mentions in the Quran that نُوَفِّيهِمْ أَعْمَالَهُمْ فِيهَا وَهُمْ فِيهَا لَا يُبْخَسُونَ, that we will give them the rewards for that in the dunya, and they will not be held back from at all. So there is still benefit. So, and many of the Sahaba, they became Muslim. One of them specifically, during the Jahiliyyah, he saw that the people were burying their young daughters, and he couldn't handle this. So he said, just give them to me, I'll raise them, and I'll marry them off. And then later on, once Islam came, he became Muslim, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ that, is it because of what I was doing that I became Muslim? And the Prophet said, yes. It's because of the good deeds that he did that Allah guided him. So we're not saying that non-Muslims don't get anything at all, or that, we're saying in a completely legal context, in order for the fast to be considered legally valid and to fall off your responsibility, it must be in the state of Islam. And then secondly, the non-Muslims are not directly demanded to follow the secondary rulings of the sacred law. Their main focus is that they follow the main essential tenets of faith. And once that happens, then all of the rest of the Sharia applies to them. And there's a slight difference of opinion in that regard, whether the non-Muslims will be asked, that they will be taken to account for the different acts of worship that they didn't do on the Day of Judgment. And those who said that they will, they used the verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Muzammil, مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُنْ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ, that the people of the right, the believers, will ask the people of the hellfire, what caused you to be in the hellfire? And their first response will be, لَمْ نَكُنْ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ, we didn't pray. And so some people said that no, they will be asked about the prayer, and they have to fast, they have to do. And others said that no, if they become Muslim, then they have to do those things. The main thing they're accountable now for is the prayer. So he mentions a middle opinion, that they're not accountable for for not doing these acts of worship that are mandatory in this world until they accept Islam. But in the next life, they will be taken into account for not accepting Islam, and then everything that they missed out on for not accepting Islam. So all those secondary worships as well. Right. So in order for the fast to be valid, it must be a Muslim doing it. The second is, and that's the same reason why if a person becomes Muslim, they don't have to make qada of anything in the past. They don't have to repeat the 20 years that since they were Badr. The second one is maturity, bulugh. And this is to reach the age of puberty. And there's one of 2 ways to consider whether that happens or not. The first is that there is a sign from the signs of puberty, whether it be ejaculation or whether it be menstruation for the women. Those are the main signs. The other signs are secondary signs. They're not used in and of themselves as proof of bulugh. But if no sign has been seen, then by the 15 years old, both the boys and the girls are legally considered baligh, even if no sign was there. Now, the earliest possible time that these signs can be seen is 12 years old in men or in boys, and 9 years old in girls, because the menstruation can happen as early as 9. Any bleeding that happens before 9 years old is not considered hayd. It's not considered menstruation. It's considered irregular bleeding, and the rulings are there in the fiqh books about that. Right? But even though the fast is not obligatory on them, right, meaning a child who has not reached puberty yet, the same rulings of the prayer apply to fasting and all of the obligatory acts. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Muru awladakum bis-salati wa hum abna'u sab'a wa duribuhum 'alayha wa hum abna'u 'ashr." Command your children to pray when they are 7, and discipline them for not doing so when they're 10. Right, so the 7-year-old is not baligh, so it's not wajib for them to fast. It's not wajib for them to pray. Right, but the Prophet is saying that command them to pray at 7. Tell them they have to pray at 7, right? But in a lenient way, such that if they didn't do it sometimes, there's no consequences. But just general encouragement. But when they become 10 years old, right, then, and this is when they're on the cusp of becoming mature. The idea here is that to get them used and accustomed to performing these acts of worship, so that as soon as they become mature, that they not only have the knowledge to be able to do it, but they already are in the habit of doing it, and then they don't miss any of the obligations for their entire life. So this hadith is about salat, but it applies to all of the obligations. So it applies to hijab, for instance. It applies to fasting. It applies to being respectful to your parents. All of the obligations of Islam. So the child that is 10 years old, but there's a condition if they are physically able to do it. Right? So if it's hard for them to fast, then we can slowly start to do what's called riyada. Riyada, where you train them slowly. That maybe at 7 years old they fast from Fajr to Dhuhr. At 7 years old, and then at 8 years old or maybe 9 years old we go from Fajr to Asr, right? And then from Fajr to Maghrib a couple days a week, right? And then Fajr to Maghrib for the whole time when they're 10. And then if there's some days that they're just really not used, it's not easy for them, then to be a little bit lenient in that case. So Islam, bulugh, so being a Muslim, being mature. The third is aql, to have one's intellect intact. Aql is qayd ihtirazi. It's an exclusionary detail, meaning the opposite is not true. The opposite is excluded. So the opposite of aql is junoon, insanity. And not in the way, the movie theater kind of ways, but someone who doesn't have full capability of intellect, then they are not obliged to pray or to fast or any of these obligatory acts of Islam. So the opposite of aql is junoon, someone who doesn't have their sanity at all. But in between the two, there is a middle area called the ma'tuh. The ma'tuh would be someone who has a limited intellectual function, limited sanity. And so a lot of the types of mild autism would be in this rank. So even the ma'tuh, even the gray area between the two, is still considered not aqil. So it's not wajib for them to fast or to pray. Now there's a third category where there's some types of autism and some types of mental conditions where they're on and off. So one day, right, or even from hour to hour, they can be completely different. And we went to a Muslim autistic school in Singapore, and some of the students, right, they memorized all the presidents of the U.S., right? And you can list them for you. They can do the adhan completely. They memorize things completely. And then an hour later, they're having a meltdown, right? They're completely different, right? So in that kind of situation, whatever time it is, right, if they're on it, then they should pray. They should be encouraged to pray. Right? But if they are kind of in a meltdown or having a traumatic moment, then they're not obliged to pray. Right? So, because aql is the specific point of moral responsibility. Because of the intellect, we can discern between good and evil, right and wrong, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and the most important is to be able to sacrifice immediate pleasures for long-term benefits, which is the whole point of our deen. That we're sacrificing our sleep a little bit, right, to pray Fajr. Why? Because of Jannah, for the sake of Allah. But the person who doesn't have that intellect can't really discern that type of difference, right? And therefore, it's not fair for them. So, and the religion, Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. He has not put any undue hardship on you in the religion. And he mentions the hadith of Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi, which is a hadith Hasan, which is a rank slightly under the Sahih, but it's very strong hadith. He says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, رُفِعَ الْقَلَمُ عَنْ ثَلَاثَةٍ. The pen has been lifted from 3. And the pen, meaning the pen that writes the sins. The pen that writes the good deeds and the sins. The pen has been lifted from 3, from the child until they become mature, until they reach puberty, from the sleeping person until they wake up, and from the ma'tu, which is the person who has deficient intellect, until they are freed of that sickness, if they are cured. So we see from here, and then the only one of those is not absolute, is the sleeping person. Right, so if a person slept through an entire salat time, right, if it was intentional, then they're sinful. They have to make up the prayer. If it was unintentional, then they're not sinful, but they still have to make up the prayer. One of the most famous speakers and lecturers of the Imams of America, almost all of you know, right, he came to me. I met him in Boston. I met him in a masjid, and he told me that I just slept through 3 salats straight. Accidentally, like he was just layover. Right? I slept through 3 salats. How do you sleep for 3 salats? Allahu Akbar. Right, so there's no sin. There's no sin, but you still have to make up the prayers afterwards. The final condition is itaqatus sawm. He says the 3rd, but he repeats 2 twice. And so this is actually the 4. There's a mistake in the book. That they are physically able to fast. The person must be physically able to fast. In some books, you'll see the condition written as healthy, right? Meaning physically able to fast, right? So if a person is unable to fast, either because of sickness, or because of old age, or other types of things, is that they aren't sick because they're taking a medicine that they have to take every day. But if they don't take the medicine, they will become sick. So if they're fasting, right, and because of the fast they can't take that medicine, right, then their blood pressure skyrockets and something happens, then that's also an excuse, even though currently they're not sick. So all of those would be considered valid excuses in the sacred law. However, what type of sickness? Meaning a sickness that fasting during it would be unduly difficult for any normal person like yourself. And the way that you would judge that is if you took 10 people like yourself, that majority of them wouldn't be able to handle it. Maybe the strong ones would, but the weak ones wouldn't. But the majority, percentage-wise, would not be able to handle it. Right. So for them, they are excused. But instead of the fasting, they would pay fidya, an expiatory charity. Also added to this specific criteria of being able to fast is the condition that the female must be free of menstruation or postnatal bleeding, right? Because during menstruation and postnatal bleeding, it is not, and that fasting is not valid, right? So, but it's still wajib, but it's delayed until the menstruation is over, right? So the fasting is made up, but with regards to prayer, it's completely excused and it's not made up. Tamam. Right, so what are the 4 conditions? That they must be Muslim, they must be baligh, they must be aqil, they must have their intellect, and then they must be healthy enough to perform the fast without putting themselves in undue difficulty or delaying their cure. Now, just as a point of, and these are all the same conditions for the Hanafi school as well. As for establishing whether your sickness is a hardship or not, or just an inconvenience, the scholars, they mention a few different ways to judge that. One is by experience, that you fasted before in this state, right, and it was very difficult for you, and your sickness got worse, or this or that, right? So you know from experience. The second is that a Muslim doctor gives you advice that you should not fast. However, in this second part, there's an extra condition that is not always mentioned. The condition is that Muslim doctor, along with giving you advice according to his medical knowledge or her medical knowledge, they're also giving you advice according to the knowledge of the Sharia, of the sacred law. So they do know what would be a valid, recognized excuse in the Sharia too. Right? So, and it's not as common to find a doctor who knows both the minimum required from the sacred law and their medicine. Right? So if the doctor is either a non-Muslim or they're a Muslim, but you're not so sure, or they're not very well versed in the sacred law as specific to these rulings, then you can use the doctor's opinion to form your own opinion. And if you are reasonably sure that this would lead to hardship based on the evidences, either by experience or by the doctor's testimony, then you are allowed to not fast. Right? And then if later on you find that you're healthy, then you can fast another day. What is the verse? مَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. Whoever amongst you is sick or on a journey, then you can do those days at another time. أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ, other days. Right? But the person who can never be cured of their sickness, then they're the ones who recourse to the expiatory charity. So if someone has an illness that's chronic, that they'll never be cured from, or they're not likely to be cured from, then that will stop them from fasting now or even in the future. So there is no makeup for them. Right? Instead of fasting, they would pay a charity of about 2 kg of wheat, or the value thereof in the Hanafi school, per day. Question? So part of that's a good question. So part of this being able to fast, right, if a woman is pregnant or if she's nursing, and by fasting there will be harm to herself or to the child, then in the Hanafi school she is allowed to not fast, and she only has to make it up. She only has to make up the fast at a later date. In the Shafi'i school, there's quite detailed discussion about this, that if she fears for her own self, right, then she has to make qada but no expiation. If she fears for the child only, then just expiation and no qada. And if she fears for herself and the child, then I'm not exactly sure of that detail, that last one. But these are things we can write down, and we can pass them by Sheikh Yahya, inshallah ta'ala. But that's a good point. Any other questions before we move on these 4 conditions? So being Muslim, being mature, having sound intellect, and being healthy enough to fast. Right, so the traveler is shurutul ada. So these are the conditions for it to be obligatory. So if these conditions are there, and 1, it's obligatory, and 2, it's valid. Right? But for the traveling is a condition for validity. Right? So if the traveler fasts, it's valid. Right? But they are permitted to not fast. Right? So they can delay performance because of that. So that's a slightly different category, but that should be mentioned, because I don't think he mentions it here. Right, so we mentioned the verse just now, مَنْ كَانَ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. Whoever is sick or on a journey, then they can fast other days. Right? Because the journey is a place where there is hardship, there's assumed amount of hardship that's going to be there anyway. Even in modern times, layovers and all these things. I once fasted from flying from UK to the US, and it was like 22-hour fast. I didn't know, I was only like a second-year student. I didn't know that you could not fast. So my jahil caused me I was passed out practically when I got there. And they're asking me to pray tarawih. Right? It was really bad. So the traveler doesn't have to fast, because it may entail putting them in hardship, but they can if they want to. They can if they want to. Right? However, the condition is that they are ready or out of the city limits before the fasting came in. Right? So if they're there, so if we're here, for instance, after Fajr, say just before Dhuhr, then we start traveling. Right? That's different. That's problematic, because now the fast already was obligatory on us, right? And then we left. Right? So that's a slightly different. So for them, they'd have to continue the fast unless there is actual undue hardship. Then they can break it and then make it up. Good question. Any other questions? Fasting person. So medicines, if someone has to take medicine, then if they can, there's other ways of taking medicine. So for instance, in the Shafi'i school as well as the Hanafi school, intramuscular injections do not break the fast. right? What's it called? Intravascular, if I'm saying it right, which is in the veins. So if it's in the muscles, the needle in the muscles doesn't break the fast. So if someone has diabetes or something, and if there's an opportunity to take a shot instead of a pill, right, and they really do want to fast, it's not that they have to seek this out, but if they want to fast, then that may be a valid recourse. In the Hanafi school, even in the veins, doesn't break the wudu, doesn't break the fasting. Definitely doesn't break the wudu either. Tamam. So that's right, to tell whether a person must fast or not. Right? If they're Muslim, they're adult, they're sane, and they're healthy, then they have to fast. It's obligatory for them to fast, whether they're male or female. Tamam. The next is how to make a valid fast. So he talks about the arkan of the fast. So the arkan are the obligations that are within the act. The arkan are the obligations that are the fara'id, the obligations that are within the action, as opposed to the shurut, which are the conditions, are the obligations that precede the action. So they're both fard. A condition or the integral are both fard, but one precedes the action and one is in the action. Same thing in wudu, in salat. Wudu is fard, right, as a prerequisite to prayer, but in the prayer, the sajda is fard. So one is a rukn and one is a shart. So he says the first rukn is a niyyah. Right? And this goes back to the original definition, imsakun makhsus bi niyyatin makhsusa min shakhsin makhsus, a specific type of refraining with a specific intention from a very specific person. So we talked about the specific person. Now we're talking about the intention. So in the Hanafi school as well as the Shafi'i school, right, and I would assume the other schools as well, it is not valid to fast without an intention. Right? It is not valid to fast without an intention. The only things where the Hanafis are a bit more lenient with regards to the intention are for those acts of worship that are seen as acts of worship secondary to something else, that they're a means to do another act, like wudu. Wudu in and of itself is not a specific act of worship intrinsically. It becomes an act of worship when you use it for other things. So if someone were to make wudu, stand there for 5 seconds, and then make another wudu, they're not drawing nearer to Allah by just making more and more wudu. It's actually sinful to waste water like that. Right? So for the wudu in the Hanafi school, it is valid without an intention. That's because it's ibadah ghayru maqsudah. It's not sought in and of itself as an act of worship. Right? But for any act of worship that is sought in and of itself, like fasting or hajj or zakat or prayer, then the intention is obligatory, just like it is in the Shafi'i school. Right? So, and he mentions here the verse of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, and many of the hadith books start with this hadith. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَىٰ. Actions are only based on their intentions. Okay? And everyone will get only what they intended. So if someone did not intend to fast for the sake of Allah, then it would not count. Right? So he mentions here, what does that fast entail? He says that the fasting, the definition of the intention, the definition of intention is قَصْدُ شَيْءٍ مُقْتَرِنًا بِفِعْلِهِ, is to seek to do an action, to have a desire to do something that is connected with the action itself. Is connected with the action itself. So if I make intention that 5 years from now I'm going to make wudu, that doesn't count. Right? That's a raja, that's a hope. That's not an intention. An intention is that right when I'm rolling up my sleeves, I'm taking off my hat, and I have it in my heart, I intend to make the wudu. That's called an intention. Right? So in the case of fasting, it would be just before the time of Fajr. Right? That's the time that the fasting counts. And for all the other worships, it would be right when you start to do it. Right? Tamam. Now we get into some of the slightly nuanced differences about the niyyah. So according to the Shafi'i school, it is obligatory to make the intention to fast in the nighttime before the day of fasting. And he mentions a few different hadith in this regard. He says that من لم يجمع الصيام قبل الفجر فلا صيام له. Whoever does not, it literally means gather, but that's what they use for the intention. You gather your intention. Whoever doesn't gather the intention to fast before Fajr, then they have no fast. they have no fast. Right, so in the Shafi'i school, it's very specific that if you're fasting the day of Ramadan, that you have to make the niyyah the night before. And what does it mean by the night before? Before the adhan of Fajr. Before the adhan of Fajr. So if Fajr came in and you haven't made an intention to fast that day, then that fast doesn't count, but you still have to refrain from food, but it doesn't count. So you're refraining from food because of the sanctity of the time. Right? No one should be eating at this time, especially in public. If you're but this is only for the obligatory. This is for the obligatory, not the nafil. The nafil prayers, the nafil fast, according to all of the schools, that you can make the intention up to just before dhuhr. And the reason for that is because there's many hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he would come to Sayyidah Aisha and he would ask, is there any food? And she would say no. And he would say, Inni idhan sa'im. Right? Then I'm going to fast. And this happened in the middle of the day. Right? And he didn't already eat. So as long as someone didn't already eat or do anything that would normally break the fast, right? If they intend to fast before the middle of the day, just before dhuhr, then that fast counts if it's a voluntary fast. As for the Hanafi school, if it's a day of Ramadan that you're performing, current day, it's not a makeup you're performing, then you can make the niyyah all the way up to just before the dhuhr, up to before the zawal time, which is 4 minutes before dhuhr. Then it would still be valid, and that's similar to the nafil prayer, the nafil fast that we just mentioned. However, if you're making up a fast in Ramadan, the intention has to be from the night before, like the Shafi'is. It has to be from the night before. And the reason is that any intention during the month of Ramadan would automatically be assumed to be the fast of Ramadan, right? Because there's nothing else you can do in this time. So the idea of the intention is to specify one act as opposed to other possibilities. So, and this is why in the prayer, you have to specify which prayer you're praying, right? Because if it's dhuhr time, right, and I'm going like this, right, I'm definitely pretending to pray, but for the salat to be valid, I have to say, I have to intend that I'm praying dhuhr for it to count as my fard. Because I could be praying sunnah, or I could pray makeup of another day, or I can pray salat al-hajjah, or salat al-istikhara, I can be praying anything. So because I could be doing multiple different things, or multiple possibilities could be happening, then I have to specify it with the intention. But in Ramadan, there is no such thing as any other fast in Ramadan. Because you can only fast once a day. Right? Whereas a prayer, you can do 15 prayers in one prayer time. Right? So the niyyah specifies, but in Ramadan, there's no need for specification. So even if a person intended in Ramadan, I'm fasting nafil, right? In the Hanafi school, it would count as their fard. And this is why the day of doubt, the Yom Shak, the 29th of Sha'ban, if you don't see the moon, then the khawas, meaning the scholars, are supposed to fast. Right? But they're supposed to fast with the intention of nafil only. Right? And then not, if it's Ramadan, then, and we'll talk about this later, right? To have a double-edged intention doesn't count. Right? If it's Ramadan, then it's for Ramadan. If it's not for Ramadan, then it's nafil. That doesn't count. So because the scholars are more likely to be able to do that, to make a firm intention just on nafil, right, then they fast that day. And if it does happen to be Ramadan, it counts for Ramadan. Because there's nothing else you can do in Ramadan except for Ramadan. But the general public are commanded not to fast at all, because if it's Ramadan, then I want it to be for Ramadan. If it's not, then they're more likely to be doing that. Right. So if it's a current Ramadan fast, then the intention is valid all the way up to just before Zawal, as long as a person didn't do anything intentionally to break the fast before that. It is recommended to make the intention before Fajr comes in. So as to leave out or to exit the difference of opinion between the Shafi'i scholars. So really our goal as Muslims is not only to do what's valid in our madhab, but if we, after accomplishing that and being steadfast on that, if we can slowly start to add to that what would make our actions valid according to all the scholars, then that's recommended. Right, so al-khuruju min al-khilafi mustahab. Right, leaving the differences of opinion is recommended. So anytime, so for instance, you see many of the people, many of the awliya, their wudu, the way they do the wudu is valid according to all the madhabs. And the way they pray their prayer is valid according to all the madhabs. And especially if someone is an imam or they're leading a community that has multiple schools of thought, then to lead the prayer, they should keep in mind all of these other schools as well. And so for the Hanafi, right, to make the intention before wudu, right? Obviously, it's an emphasized sunnah, but it'll be even more emphasized because now, if you do so, then your wudu is valid according to Imam Shafi as well. Now, there's no difference of opinion that your wudu is valid, right? And this is what we want to do. We want to act in a way that our actions are as most likely as possible accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the minimum is your own madhab. Now, the intention, since Ramadan is 30 days and each individual day is seen as one separate act of worship, right, and intention is obligatory every single day. Each day needs its own intention, according to majority of the scholars. So in the Hanafi school and in the Shafi'i school, every day you have to renew your intention, every day. However, in the Maliki school, Ramadan is seen as one thing, right? So you can, before the first fast of Ramadan starts, you can say, I intend to fast the whole month of Ramadan, right? And it would count even if one of the days inside, in between those 30, you didn't make an intention, it would count. All right, so how do we understand this? Right? We should make an intention every day, first and foremost. We should make an intention every day, keeping in mind that the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school, right, make that obligatory. But we should also make an intention at the beginning of Ramadan that we're going to fast the whole month. And the reason is that if, as a Hanafi or as a Shafi'i, one day we forget to make the intention, it would still count according to Imam Malik. Right? And then it would be cautious to make that day up anyway. Right, so a lot of these rulings are based on caution. Now he says, what do you say in your intention? First of all, the intention has nothing to do with your tongue. Intention has nothing to do with your tongue. The intention is a matter of the heart. It is knowledge of something that you have resolved to do. You know that you want to do this thing and you're resolute in doing it. Right? It doesn't mean that you don't have to say it, right? If saying it helps you bring to heart what you want to do, then it's recommended to say it. Otherwise, the intention is in the heart, right? So if a person wakes up for suhoor, right? They bust out their samosas and they put them in their air fryer and they get their dates and everything, and someone tapped them on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" And there's no doubts that they would say, "I'm about to fast, so I'm going to eat suhoor." Right? That in and of itself is an intention, even if they didn't say anything. Same thing for the person who's walking toward the sink, sleeves rolled up, hat off, right? And then they do this action, right? And then they say, "Wait, I didn't make an intention." Yes, you did. You rolled your sleeves up. Why did you roll your sleeve up? Because I didn't want them to get wet. Why would they get wet? Because I'm making wudu. There you go. That was your intention, right? So the intention is not something that's some very esoteric, abstract concept that you have to capture it by saying it and pronouncing it out loud. Right? If you know what you're doing, and if someone tapped you on the shoulder, you didn't have to think about, I think I'm fasting. Right? As long as you're not like that, then you are fasting. Right? So every day that you wake up for suhoor, every day that you intend, right? So every night, but it's helpful to pronounce it. And by pronouncing it, deeper meanings of the intention are available. So it's not just I'm going to do it, but you can also remind yourself that you're doing it for Allah, that you're doing this for higher purposes, and in that there's benefit in that. So he says that it is a condition of validity of the fasting to intend to fast tomorrow, because you have to fast, you have to intend from the night. I'm going to fast in the morning of Ramadan, right? And he says that it's a condition for that intention to be to be sound, that intention be resolute, that you're certain that I'm going to fast, not mutaraddid. Mutaraddid is the one who's going back and forth. Like, so he says, "Nawaitu fard as-sawm ghadan in kana min Ramadan." Right? If I'm in asbahtu sahihan, if I'm feeling okay tomorrow, then I'll fast. That's not resolute. Right? If I'm feeling okay, then I'll fast. If not, then I don't. So that's not considered intention. In Hanafi school, you still have up to Zawal to make up your mind. Right? But or if I'm going to travel, if I'm traveling tomorrow, then I'm not going to fast. Right? That's not an intention. So you have to be resolute. I'm going to fast tomorrow. And then if something happens and you wake up and you're not, then you can ask someone how to get out of that. Tamam. And he mentions the full version of the niyyah if you're going to say it. He says, نويت صوم غد عن أداء فرض رمضان هذه السنة لله تعالى. So on the Ramadan charts that you've all been given, on the top of it, it has this formula of the niyyah. And by doing it this way, by saying it this way, it's valid according to all the madhabs, unanimously. Because the specific details of how it's pronounced include all of the conditions of the other schools as well. Right, so nawaitu sawm ghadin, intending as a morning, an adai, to perform a current obligatory day of Ramadan, right, for during this year. So you're specifying even more from the other Ramadans. Tamam. And then he mentions, what if you forget to intend? Allahu Akbar. Now for the Hanafi, or the Maliki as well, if you forget to intend, for the Malikis it doesn't matter, as long as you intended the whole month from the beginning. Right? Then each individual day, it doesn't matter. For the Hanafi, if you forgot to intend and you woke up, even if you woke up after Fajr, you missed Suhoor and everything, as long as it's not Dhuhr Salat yet, you can still make the intention. Because the idea is that majority of the day you've intended, so the majority counts for the whole. But in the Shafi'i school, he says that if a person did not make an intention, then they have to refrain from eating and drinking because of the sanctity of the time, and then they have to make up that fast at another time. Right? But if they wake up and it's still before the Zawal time, before the Dhuhr time, they should still make an intention out of hopes that it will be valid with Allah according to the Hanafi school. And again, this is a Shafi'i scholar writing, but he's considering the other schools with regards to our relationship with Allah. And because all of these schools are valid schools, it doesn't mean that we jump between the two, between them, but we do consider them when we make our decisions in hopes that Allah will accept. Then he says the second rukn, so the first integral is the intention, the second integral is to abstain from those things that break the fast. And this is the most, arguably one of the most important parts of this section, is what breaks your fast. What breaks your fast? So he defines, he mentions here, he says, when does the time for fasting start, such that the rulings of what breaks your fast also start? And he says, from the immediate time of the adhan of Fajr, meaning if the adhan is exactly when Fajr enters. Right? If the mu'adhin is yawning, just rolled out of bed, and he's 5 minutes late, right? Fasting started 5 minutes before that. Right? So as soon as Fajr comes in, fasting starts. Right? And the reason why he's saying this is so that this misunderstanding that's become famous, that if the adhan is going on and you still have a cup in your hand, or you still got your bowl with your fork in there, right? You can finish your meal. La, that is not correct. The reason why that opinion was there is because Bilal ibn Abi Rabah, the mu'adhin of the Prophet ﷺ, he would call the adhan, and the Prophet ﷺ would continue to eat. Right? However, Bilal, even though he was the only appointed mu'adhin of the Prophet ﷺ, he wasn't the only mu'adhin. He wasn't the only one to call the prayer. So when Bilal was appointed to call the prayer for tahajjud, right, which is an additional adhan, which they still do in Saudi, in the Haram, to call the adhan a certain period of time before Fajr comes in, so people can wake up to pray the voluntary night vigil prayer, the tahajjud prayer. And then Ibn Maktoum, the blind Sahabi from Abasa wa Tawalla, that the Prophet frowned and turned away, that was this Sahabi. He's the one who would call the adhan for Fajr. So when Bilal called the adhan, it wasn't Fajr yet. The Prophet continued to eat, right? But he stopped before the real adhan of Fajr. Right? So as soon as the time of Fajr comes in, he mentions here that if a person is eating, they have to stop eating. And if they have food in their mouth, then there's a slight difference of opinion. Right? In the Hanafi school, whatever is already in your mouth, right, is considered inside your body. Right? And if after the adhan comes, you swallow it, you didn't put anything in, right, to break your fast. It was already in. right? And the same thing applies to salat. So if you ate, you had your dal soup, right? And you had a lentil stuck in your tooth. Then the adhan went off, and the lentil came loose, and you swallowed it. It doesn't break your fast, because the lentil was already inside before. But if the lentil was on your beard, for instance, right, and you're like, oh, wait, and you ate it after the Fajr adhan, right, then it breaks your fast, because it came from outside and it went inside. The same thing in the prayer. If you have food in your mouth during the prayer, right, before you even started the prayer, the food was there, and then you say Allahu Akbar, and then it came loose. If it's small, then it doesn't break. However, I believe the Shafi opinion is a little bit more strict in this regard. I think I have the opinion here. Yeah, so it is obligatory to stop eating immediately when hearing the adhan of the Fajr prayer. So whoever hears the adhan, it's obligatory for them to refrain from food. And if he or she has food in their mouth or a sip of water that they have yet to swallow, then they have to spit it out. They have to spit it out. Because if they don't spit it out, then it'll break their fast. So the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school are a little bit different in that regard. Right? If it's already in the mouth before the Fajr time entered, right, then it's fair game in the Hanafi school. Right? But it has to be spit out in the Shafi'i school. Then exactly what breaks the fast? He starts about the ones that are less obvious, and then he talks about the obvious ones. So the first is apostasy. Right? Leaving Islam. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, may Allah save us from that, either by a statement of disbelief, like if someone made a statement of disbelief intentionally, or an action, like prostrating to someone else other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, intending worship, right? That would be an action that would take someone out of Islam, or throwing the mushaf in a disrespectful, or out of disrespect, or throwing the Quran or something like that. That would be disbelief by action, by intention. Intending to disbelieve, even if one doesn't do it, is immediately disbelief. I think tomorrow I might leave Islam. Already they left. Right? By intention. You might not want to tell somebody that. You try to bring them back. Right? Or by belief. Or they have an erroneous belief that is tantamount to actual kufr, not just bid'ah. So leaving Islam breaks the fast. Right? So if they were fasting, because the fasting is only obligatory on the Muslim. Menstruation and postnatal bleeding, if it happens any time during the day, even for a moment, then that fast doesn't count. That day would have to be made up for another time. So if a woman had menstruation, and just before the Fajr adhan came, she became pure, right? Then that day is obligatory on her. Right? If just after the Fajr adhan came, say like Fajr adhan came 5, 10, 15 minutes later, then she found out she was pure, then she's not obliged to pray to fast that day. She will make it up later because there was a portion of the day in which there was menstruation. So that whole day doesn't count if a portion of the day has menstruation. Same thing if a woman fasts, miskina, poor lady, she starts fast from Fajr, right? And then 5 minutes before Maghrib, menstruation starts. Right? Technically, that fast does not count. She has to make it up, unfortunately. But she will get the reward for the difficulty. It's not an all or nothing game. It's not all or nothing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third is, he says, childbirth, even if there is no blood that's seen. And this would be the cautious opinion. In the Hanafi school, if a child is born and there's no blood, there is no nifas. And if there's no nifas, then the only thing that breaks is the wudu. The fasting would still be valid, but it would be cautious because it's very unlikely that there's not a single drop of blood, right? And there may be a drop of blood that you just couldn't see. So it is the cautious opinion to take this opinion. He mentions next, junun, to fall into insanity or to lose one's sanity, even for a moment. In the Shafi'i school, it breaks the fast. It breaks the fast, even if it's for a moment. Right? But in the Hanafi school, it doesn't break the fast unless the person was insane for the entire day from before Fajr. Then that fast would have to be made up. Next is fainting and intoxication. I don't know how intoxication would apply. I really don't. Unless someone got drunk right before Fajr and then Fajr came in. Allahu A'lam. But here he says it breaks the fast. And fainting. So fainting is more likely. So in the Hanafi school, fainting doesn't break the fast. Right? if the fainting happened during the day. But if a person fainted before Fajr and then woke up after Maghrib, right, that fast didn't count. Right? They fainted before Fajr came in, and they came back to consciousness after Maghrib. So they technically didn't eat anything or drink anything, right? But they had no niyyah. There was no intention. Right? But if a person intended, Fajr came in, right, say about 10 o'clock, they fainted. And then they woke up after Maghrib. They started the day with intention and they didn't eat any drink or anything the whole day. So it would count, right? Even though they didn't really have a choice in the matter. But in the Shafi'i school, if someone faints during Ramadan, that day has to be made up, according to this. And then the major one is وَصُورُ عَيْنًا إِلَى مَا يُسَمَّى جَوْفًا, right? For an essence of sorts to reach a part of the body that is known to be a cavity. And a jawf is an empty portion of the body, so the cavity of the body. So this applies whether it's food or whether it's drink, right? Whether it's phlegm for the Shafi'is is swallowed. There's conditions with that. Whether it's medicine, whether it's in the Hanafi school, the conditions of that is a little bit different. So in Hanafi school is anything that can be avoided, that enters into a recognized entry point, which would be the mouth, the nose, and the anus, and for the women, the front private part as well. Right, from a recognized entry point to a recognized cavity, which would be the stomach, right, or the throat, or the intestines, in a recognized fashion. In a recognized fashion, meaning that it goes in through one of the recognized openings. So, for instance, if someone had an injection, right, it wouldn't break the fast because it's not a recognized entry point. Okay, if a fly flew in your mouth and you accidentally swallowed it, right, that doesn't break your fast because it was unavoidable. Right? What else? Smoke. So, good question. So, about smoke. So, anything that is intentionally taken in to the body that has smoke or steam breaks the fast. Right? Smoke or steam. Just mere air, like a fragrance or a smell, that doesn't break the fast. But smoke or steam has a type of essence to it. Right? So, if a person smokes cigarettes during Ramadan, it breaks their fast. Right? And I don't know of any difference of opinion in that regard. But if someone burns some incense in the house and you walked past it, or you're walking in a store and there's like some diffuser blowing steam at you, and you walk past it and you didn't intend to breathe it in, it doesn't break your fast. Right? But if you go and say, and you waft it to yourself, then that would break the fast. Same thing, you got the spaghetti cooking. Right? And you want to check and see if it's done. You open the lid and all this waft of steam comes and hits you. If it was unintentional, it doesn't break your fast. Right? But if you're intending to do that, right, intending to smell it or to take in that steam, then it would break the fast. So that's something to be careful of. Yeah? There's a condition that I should have mentioned, right? And there's no difficulty in avoiding it. Right? There's no difficulty in avoiding it. So if someone works at a kitchen, right, and they're cooking, and there's all kinds of, like this pot, right, there's cooking over here, and there's all kinds of smoke, there's no way you can get away from it. Right? So technically, if you choose to stay in that room, you're intending to breathe in that stuff. Right? But there's no other option. It's difficult to avoid. Right? So what is considered is if you intend to do it and you have the option to not do it, it's not difficult to avoid, then it would break your fast. But if you're taking a shower and there's steam everywhere, it's difficult to avoid, and so it wouldn't break the fast in that case. Any other questions on what breaks the fast? Right. So inhalers would break the fast. Right. Eye drops would not. So eye drops is not a recognized entry point in the Hanafi school. So the recognized entry point is the nose, the mouth, the anus, and the front private part for the woman. Right. So anything that doesn't go through those routes, right, would not break the fast. Other Hanafi scholars, they added a condition that it has to stay inside, right? Such that that you can't see it anymore. And there's some weird examples, but I'll give you some better examples. So if someone sticks a Q-tip in their ear, right? So technically you put something in, and some of the Hanafis consider the ear an entry point, right? So that wouldn't break the fast. The weird example is if someone had something and they swallowed it, but it was connected to a string and they pulled it back out, it wouldn't break the fast because it didn't stay. It took it back out. Right? Same thing if someone has, that would be more of a Shafi example. Let that one be. But there are examples other than that. So for instance, like menstrual cups and tampons and stuff like that. Inserting anything that's dry, it's not wet, into the would not break the fast, right? Unless it goes to the point where it's not seeable, or goes to the distance of what's a hiqna. A hiqna is a suppository. If it goes to the distance of a suppository, and then it would break. So if there's but if it goes in and part of it stays out, then it doesn't break. So like an endoscopy, if someone has the tube down their throat, if there's no lubricant on the endoscopy, it wouldn't break the fast because part of it is still out, the other side is in, and it'll be pulled out. So it won't stay inside. Right? But if there's a liquid on it, then that liquid would break the fast. And this is all according to Hanafi school. I believe the Shafi school is a bit more strict in this regard. Any other questions? And then the last thing he mentions is intercourse, meaning just mere, and apologies if there's children, just mere insertion already breaks the fast, even if there's no ejaculation. And this applies in whatever fashion that happens. Whether it's halal or it's haram. If it's done in a halal way or it's a haram way, or with a halal person or with a haram person, right? That would break the fast immediately, right? And if it's done intentionally, this would obligate the kafaratul udhma, the major expiation, which is to fast if a person has a slave, to free a slave, but if not, to fast 2 months in a row, 60 days straight. So if anybody intentionally eats or intentionally drinks or intentionally has intercourse in the day of Ramadan after having made the intention from the night before, knowingly, right, not mistakenly and not forgetfully, then they have to make this kafara. But also that goes with this is istimna, which is masturbation, would also break the fast. And then the Shafi'i school as well as the Hanafi school, it only that it's a major sin. The Prophet said, "Nakihul yadi mal'un," the one who marries his hand is cursed. And obviously that's a metaphor for something. But the fast must be made up, but there is no expiation due. The fast must be made up, but there is no expiation, because the fulfilling of the shahwa, which is what we're supposed to stay away from in the month of Ramadan, was limited. It's not jima', it's not actual intercourse. It's less than that, so the ruling is less than that. Tamam. Right, and now all of these things, the eating, the drinking, all that, it was with the condition that it's done intentionally. Right? If a person did it forgetfully, it doesn't break the fast at all. Right? So if a person, right, they woke up first day of Ramadan, you're already in the habit of eating at a certain time, or you drink your cup of coffee. I had a teacher, he ate a whole plate of fried shrimp. Right? And then afterwards, he's washing his hands, rinsing his mouth. He's like, I was fasting. Right? The fast counts. Right? And the Prophet said that if any one of you eats forgetfully during the days of Ramadan, then that is a gift from Allah. The fast can continue your fast, and Allah has fed you. Right? And that applies to, so that's the hadith says food, but it applies to drink, and it applies to intercourse. It applies to all of the things that break the fast. If it was if a person did it not forgetting that they're not supposed to eat, that they forgot that they were fasting. However, if it was a mistake, you're making wudu, you're rinsing your mouth, and oops, right, accidentally you swallow the water, right? It breaks the fast, but there's no expiation, right? Because mistakes are not the same as forgetting. The hadith is only about forgetting. In the Shafi'i school, I do believe there is some discussion about mistakes as well. That could be checked, inshallah. Can you write that? We can talk to Sheikh Yahya about that one. So that's it. And then last he mentions the hadith. He says, after mentioning all of that, what do we understand about the hadith of Jabir, who narrates from Anas bin Malik, that 5 things break the fast of the fasting person: lying, backbiting, slandering, false oaths, and looking at something with lust, looking at something haram with lust. So he's saying, how do we understand that? None of those things fulfill those criteria. Nothing's going in the body. Right? Nothing is going in through a recognized entry point that has an essence. It's none of that. Right? Lying is not an tangible thing at all. So he says, فَهُوَ مَحْمُولٌ عَلَى ذِهَابِ أَجْرِ الصِّيَامِ. That is understood to mean that the reward of the fast is gone, even though technically it's valid. But he says, وَقَالَتْ سَيِّدَةُ عَائِشَةُ. Our mother Aisha, radiallahu anha, and Imam Ahmad and Imam Awza'i all considered that it breaks the fast itself, that it's invalid. If a person lies or backbites during the month of Ramadan, that day has to be made up. Allahu Akbar. Right? And that is not the majority opinion. Right? It is the opinion of Imam Ahmad, but the other 3 Imams, Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi, did not hold that opinion. They held the opinion that it breaks the reward of the fast, not the fast itself. Right? But it is indicative of that more than just it's not eating and not drinking during the daylight hours. More important than that is we want to try to raise to the ranks of the fast of the elites, where we're staying away from all sins of all the limbs, especially during Ramadan, but throughout the rest of the year as well. Tamam, barakallahu fikum. It's lying, backbiting, slander or gossip, it's also called a gossip, a false testimony or a false oath, and looking at something haram with lust. So we can take a couple questions, but we'll stop there, inshallah. Any questions on the sister side? Yeah, go ahead. So just mere saliva itself doesn't break the fast at all. But in the Shafi'i school, if it's phlegm that comes into the mouth, into the throat. If it's phlegm that comes into the throat to a certain point and then it's swallowed back, then that would break the fast. So he mentions here a principle. فَتَرْكُهَا مَعَ الْقُدْرَةِ عَلَى إِخْرَاجِهَا فَوَصَلَتْ إِلَى الْجَوْفِ أَفْطَرَ عَلَى الْأَصَحِّ. If someone, so according to the difference of opinions of how far that phlegm has to be, if you're able to get it out and you don't, instead you swallow it, then it will break the fast. Right? So if you had phlegm in your throat and it's far enough to where you could just spit it out, right? And you were to swallow that back, it would break the fast. But if it's so far back that you couldn't get it out, right, and you ended up swallowing it, then it doesn't break the fast. So that's just the khulasa of the 3 opinions. Imam Nawawi says that point is where the letter ha is pronounced. Ha. Imam Al-Rafi'i said it's the letter kha, which is a little further up, closer toward the tongue, to the mouth. And Imam Ghazali, he says, as long as it doesn't get to the actual mouth, right, then you can, then it doesn't break the fast. Any other questions? The Hanafi school, phlegm doesn't break the fast at all. Even if it came all the way up, attached to your lip, right, and then went back because it didn't break off. Right? If it came all the way out and then separated from your body, and then you somehow grossly put it back, then it would break. Tamam. Beautiful. See, this is what I want. I want all these questions. Yesterday, you guys were real shy or real tired. Right, so Muhafiz asked a question that what about the taste of the toothpaste in your saliva? Right, so if a person has a taste of something in their mouth, or so if they brush their teeth, for instance, and then they spit out at least one time, right, then anything they swallow after that doesn't break their fast. Same thing applies that if they wash their mouth in wudu, and they spit out at least once, if they swallow the residual wetness on their tongue, it doesn't break the fast. That even applies if someone rinsed their mouth out just because they're thirsty, and they spit it out, and then they swallowed any residual water, it would not break the fast, because the portion of water that will remain is insignificant in comparison to the saliva. It's just your saliva that you're swallowing. It's considered just like saliva, and the taste of something is not an essence. The taste of something is not an essence. Actual toothpaste would break your. If you swallowed like the foamy, whatever, suds of the toothpaste, then that would break. I think there's a question on the right first. Yeah, so if you guys want to hear a funny issue, in the Hanafi school, if you taste something, it doesn't break the fast, right? But it could be makruh, if it could be disliked, if you're putting yourself in jeopardy of possibly swallowing it, right? And so they mentioned that if a person is cooking and they have a spouse that has a very hot temper and gets angry really quickly, then it's jaiz for them to taste the food first. So if someone's going to come home and say, like, why is there no salt in my biryani, right? Right, then you're allowed to taste it. But again, she mentioned a good point that you have to spit first. Right, so after you tasted it, you spit out, right, and none of the actual food went into your mouth. Right, you're not swallowing anything. You spit out, right, and then if anything residual lasts and you swallow, it doesn't break the fast. So chapstick and lipstick does not break the fast either. Right? Unless you actually, like an actual piece of the chapstick goes into your throat. So putting it on the lips, the only thing that you would be swallowing if you did lick your lips after that would be the taste, not the essence of the thing. Yeah? That one you should discuss privately, consult privately. Most likely, no. It's very rare that something would not be valid according to some of the scholars, at least. And if it's a long period of time, then the scholars, they use the other opinions of the other schools to help people not to have to make large amounts of qada, of makeup, because our religion is not, it's not the purpose of the religion to make life hard, right? But so as long as there's room in the Sharia, there may be a way to, so that we can speak about that later, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu khair. Any other questions? Inshallah, we can take them in the next class. Just write them down. We can start with that before we start the new session, inshallah. Next, he goes into the sunnahs. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Afwan minkum.